So last time we've been talking about how cognitive psychology really came back as a revolution within the discipline of psychology, and we were talking about how the different factors that have been described in the previous video culminated in what is termed the information processing approach, right? And we'll do an example of this and discuss this, right? So an example of this is an experiment that was conducted by Sternberg. What happened was that participants were given a particular set of numbers. Now, this could be something like 3, 6, 9. They were shown this set of digits and they were asked to remember it, right? And then they were given a probe digit, such as, for example, 7 or 6, right? And they were asked to answer as quickly as possible whether this probe digit was part of the set that they had been asked to remember, right? Now, basically, what happened was that they were asked to answer as quickly as possible. So, this was a timed experiment. Now, for example, 7 here was considered a negative probe because this was not part of the original memory set, right? Whereas something like 6 was considered a positive probe because this is a digit that was part of the original memory set. Similarly, 9 would also be a positive probe, so would be 3. And if we consider negative probes, then 4 would be another example of a negative probe, so would be 5. What Sternberg did was that he not only timed the response, how quickly participants were able to respond, but he also played with the length of the memory set. So initially, for example, if he had 3, he would also have something like 4 digits in the memory set. So he could have this. Then if he were to make it even longer, then he would include another digit. So he would perhaps have 2, 3, 4, 6, and 9. And then he would repeat the experiment in the sense that he would introduce some negative probes and some positive probes and ask participants whether this particular probe, for example 7, was in the set or not. Whether if he was providing a positive probe, for example 3, he would ask participants if that was in the memory set or not, right? So this is basically what the experiment was, and this experiment is very famously known as the Sternberg paradigm. What Sternberg did with the data was that negative probes were plotted differently and positive probes were plotted differently, and what Sternberg found out was that there was a linear relationship, right, between let me show this to you graphically as well. So there was a linear relationship between the length of the memory set and the time taken for participants to respond. And another thing that Sternberg found out was, which was again very influential, was that with each added digit, participants took around 38 milliseconds more to respond, right? Now that's a very small difference if you think about it, but it is still a difference. So if he was, for example, he first had this data set, right? And if, for example, he added another digit to it, so he went to 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And if the time here to respond was something like 400 milliseconds, right? Here it would be 438 milliseconds, right? Because with every added digit, what you're doing is that you're adding 38 milliseconds, because what Sternberg what his analysis was that these 38 milliseconds that are getting added are because the individual is moving from each digit, right? and comparing the probe digit to each digit. So if your probe is, let's suppose, 6, what you're doing is that you're comparing this probe digit to this digit, then this one, and then this one, and then this one, and then making a decision as to whether this probe digit was part of the memory set or not, right? Here we have a graphic representation of the time that was taken to the reaction time and the size of the memory set. And what we see is that there's a linear relationship between these. Now these are plotted as targets and foils, and we draw a line through them, which really is in line of best fit. And this is what the line shows us, that the relationship is linear, right? But this is not the only reason. I mean, this is an interesting experiment, but this is not the only reason that this experiment was so influential, right? So why do you think this experiment is something that we're discussing when we're looking at how cognitive psychology works? Now, one of the reasons for this is because of the explanation that Sternberg put forth as to why these 38 seconds were being added with each added digit in the memory set. The explanation came in the form of a flowchart. So let me show you that as well. Here what we have in this flowchart is that 9 is the probe digit, right? And what happens when this probe digit is presented is that, firstly, you perceive stimulus, right? Then you compare it to all of the different components in your memory set, right? Then you make a decision and you generate a response. And this is what I was talking about earlier as well, that, information processing approach or information theory, right? A huge characteristic of these approaches is the use of flowcharts in order to analyze cognition and in order to sort of understand the mental processes that are underlying decisions, such as, is this particular digit part of a memory set that has been seen before or memorized, right? So this is another reason that this experiment, or what is termed the Sternberg paradigm, is so influential. Let me show you a host of other reasons which are also very, very important. One of the things that you notice in this experiment is that you're discussing information processing, right? And you're looking at how cognition is working, but you're not discussing what's happening in the brain, right? And this is very, very particular to how cognitive psychology developed. Now that we have the advent of something like cognitive neuroscience, in which we're looking at how there are different neural circuits that are underlying cognition, this is sort of changing. But it's very, very important to sort of look at this and realize the importance of it, that information processing or a mental process is being discussed without any reference to the physical structure, right? And this is very typical of the information processing approach. The processing of the information has a highly symbolic character. For example, his theory, Sternberg's theory, describes the human system as comparing the symbol 9, this is something that we saw in the flowchart, against the symbol 3, without considering how these symbols might be represented in the brain. So basically, you're working with symbols, right? And you're not concerning yourself with what may be going on in the brain, right? The third point is the processing of information can be compared to the way computers process information, right? And in fact, Sternberg was using the computer metaphor to justify his own theory, right? So that's something that's very visible as well, that you're using computer metaphors in order to understand human cognition. You're making analogies to computers, right? Then you have the fact that the measurement of time to make a judgment is a critical variable, right? What you believe is that information processing is happening in these discrete steps, right? And that's what we saw in the flowchart here, that there are these steps that are sort of followed in coming to a particular decision. So the measurement of time is also something that is a very critical variable here, right? But all of these different points really bring you to how, the Sternberg paradigm was extremely influential, because it was providing a new way to think about cognition and to sort of a new way to analyze cognition, really. And that is why it was sort of leading up to what we term is the cognitive revolution within psychology, right? Then obviously we also have cognitive neuroscience, which is something that we've sort of touched on earlier as well, that you have all of these different imaging techniques, all of this new technology that really is helping us understand the neural basis of human cognition, right? Or how exactly cognition is realized in the brain. And this sort of brings us to what we started off with in saying that cognitive psychology is also the study of how cognition is realized in the brain, right? So we're going to wrap it up with this, and I hope that you have, by the end of it, some understanding of the evolution of cognitive psychology.